We carried no books, no tablets, no ink, yet our entire history lived in the fragile breath between one voice and another. Stories were the first bridges across time, lasting longer than stone, outliving empires and ice. For 1,000 generations, memory itself was our only archive. Step back in time and enter the firelit world where words alone kept humanity alive. There is a paradox buried deep in the human mind. We are creatures of memory, and yet memory dies with us. A single breath of firelight, a single voice breaking silence, once carried the entire weight of human history. For tens of thousands of years, there was no clay tablet, no ink, no page. All that we were, our victories, our terrors, our love songs and myths, existed only in the fragile medium of spoken words, carried mouth to ear, heart to heart. The oldest libraries were not carved in stone. They lived in people, burning in their breath. Anthropologists call this the long silence before writing, but in truth it was never silence. It was a chorus that stretched across 1,000 generations, each one leaning close to the fire, listening to the tales of the dead. For 95% of our species' existence, every story was oral. The Iliad, before Homer ever scratched it onto parchment, was sung for centuries by countless unknown voices. Aboriginal song lines in Australia map rivers, stars, and mountains across tens of thousands of years. The stories outlived empires and glaciers, not because they were written, but because they were woven into memory, obligation, and ritual. But how did fragile words endure longer than stone? How did stories cross deserts, oceans, and millennia without collapsing into noise? The answer lies in the strange durability of the human voice, in the mind's hunger to keep remembering. Pause for a moment. When you tell a child a bedtime story, do you not feel the echo of an ancient duty? Somewhere in that gesture is the same act that carried the tale of the first fire, the first hunt, the first flood. Is it possible that the most powerful archive in human history is not a building of stone, but the compulsion of one person to lean close and whisper to another? The earliest stories were not written because they could not be, but they also did not need to be. For people living 40,000 years ago, words were not separate from the body. They were performed, sung, chanted, danced. They were embedded in rhythm, in the drum of feet, the clap of hands, the sway of firelight. When knowledge is performed, it resists forgetting. Neuroscience today reveals that rhyme, rhythm, and melody lock memory in place, like knots on a cord. That is why shamans spoke in chants, why myths rise and fall like poetry, why genealogies were recited in musical cadences. To survive, the past had to sound beautiful enough to be remembered. So myths were not accidents. They were tools of survival, memory machines disguised as wonder. A flood myth encoded warnings about rising waters. A tale of a wandering ancestor carried the map of a river's bends. The story of a trickster reminded the tribe that rules could bend but not break. Survival depended on story. Without it, directions were lost, rituals forgotten, alliances broken. If you failed to tell your children the right story, your lineage might vanish into hunger or war. Imagine a small group of hunter-gatherers huddled under the Milky Way 50,000 years ago. They have no paper, no metal, no wheels, but they have stories. The elder clears his throat, and what spills from him is not merely entertainment. It is history, science, law, and prayer fused together. He chants the names of animals, the paths of stars, the origins of fire. Each word is old, older than any hut or tool they own. He did not invent it. He received it like a torch, and his task is to pass it onward, unchanged, burning. In that act lies the continuity of the human world. And yet every voice adds something. Over time, the stories shifted, grew, broke into branches. This is the paradox of oral tradition. It survives because it changes. Rigidity kills memory. A tale too stiff to adapt to new landscapes or dangers will die. A tale too loose will dissolve. Somewhere between the two, between repetition and reinvention, stories find their immortality. That is why the same flood myth echoes in Mesopotamia, India, and the Pacific Islands. Not because it was copied word for word, but because human minds carried its skeleton across oceans, reshaping its flesh to fit new lands. But what does this mean for us now, who live in an age of endless written archives, digital vaults, and data that seems indestructible? Perhaps we have forgotten how close to vanishing everything once was. A single winter, a single massacre, could silence a lineage of stories forever. There were no backups. The library burned with the body. And yet, some stories endured, which begs the haunting question, why those stories and not others? At this pause in our journey, consider, what stories do you carry that no one has written? And if you do not pass them onward, who will? The endurance of oral tradition is not only about survival, but about meaning. Stories existed to explain why. Why does the sun return each morning? Why must we bury the dead? Why must we not cross the river at night? In answering these questions, people found orientation in a world that was vast, terrifying, and uncharted. To know the story was to belong. To forget it was to be lost. And here lies the deepest truth. Oral traditions created communities as much as they preserved knowledge. When you know the same story as your neighbor, you are bound together, even if you are strangers. You can walk into a firelit camp, hear a familiar myth, and instantly know you are among kin. Storytelling was not entertainment. It was glue. It forged tribes, it kept peace, it created identity. And yet stories also divided. The tale of our ancestors set us apart from them. The myth of divine favor could justify war. Oral traditions carried both love and violence, both wisdom and illusion. They were not innocent, they were powerful. So the question remains, if memory is fragile and stories are mutable, what force kept them alive across 1,000 generations? The answer may lie not only in the mechanics of rhyme or the duty of elders, but in something deeper, the human refusal to let silence win. For in silence lies oblivion, and in story lies continuity. To speak is to resist disappearance. And so, before writing, before ink, before tablets, the world was already filled with books. Living, breathing books, carried in the minds of people who knew that their lives were short, but that the story was long. But what price was paid to keep memory alive in this way? How much was distorted, forgotten, remade? And does that matter if the flame still burned? If you close your eyes and imagine the earliest storytellers, you might picture them as elders with gray hair, wrinkled faces, and voices hoarse from smoke and years. But in truth, the keepers of memory were not always old. Sometimes the burden fell upon children, apprentices chosen for their sharp ears and strong recollection. Oral tradition was not a hobby. It was an apprenticeship as demanding as hunting or crafting tools. Knowledge had to be rehearsed daily, practiced like a muscle, sharpened like a spear. In Polynesian cultures, navigators memorized the flight of birds, the rhythm of waves, the rising and setting of specific stars. They did not consult maps. The maps lived within them. Training began early, with chants that contained hundreds of names, directions, and sequences. A child would repeat them night after night until the words carved grooves in memory. In some traditions, an error meant punishment, for a single wrong star could lead a canoe into death at sea. The stakes were absolute. Remember or perish. And yet there was joy in this burden. Anthropologists who lived among oral cultures observed that reciting a myth was never purely mechanical. It was alive. The teller adjusted rhythm to fit the audience, added gestures, emphasized moments of suspense. Storytelling was a performance, and performance deepened the memory. A story forgotten in monotony lived again when it was sung with laughter, with tears, with a trembling pause before the firelight. The human brain is not built to recall lists. It is built to recall drama. And so stories became dramatic, because drama ensured survival. But this brings us to a haunting paradox. How accurate were these stories, passed along without writing? Was memory strong enough to guard truth, or did time distort it beyond recognition? Modern experiments have shown that oral memory, when bound by ritual and community, is astonishingly precise. In West Africa, griots can recite lineages stretching back 500 years. In Vedic India, priests trained to repeat hymns without a single variation, preserving sacred sound across millennia. Aboriginal songlines encode geographic details so precisely that they remain useful even today for navigation. Accuracy was possible because accuracy was demanded. A story was not property, it was responsibility. Still, distortion crept in. Details shifted, metaphors replaced facts, embellishments became canon. But even distortion carried meaning. If a flood story changed in detail, yet always retained the memory of drowning lands, it told us something profound. That ancient people endured rising seas, and the terror marked them forever. Oral tradition did not need to be precise in numbers to preserve truth in essence. Myths are not false. They are compressed realities, folded into symbolism so they could endure beyond the lifetime of any witness. But what happened when stories traveled far beyond their place of origin? How did they stretch across deserts or leap from one island to the next? To understand, we must look at the carriers, traders, wanderers, refugees. Picture a group of nomads moving across the Sahara thousands of years ago. Their camels carry salt and shells, but their most precious cargo is invisible. Stories. Around the fire at night, they exchange not only goods, but tales. Some are fragments of myths from the north, others from the south. With each retelling, pieces merge, hybridize, evolve. Just as genetic material mingles when populations meet, stories interbreed. New myths are born. Some die quickly, others find fertile ground carried forward. This is why flood myths echo across cultures that never met. Why trickster gods appear in Africa, the Americas, and Oceania. Not because there was one source, but because human minds, facing similar fears and hopes, sculpted similar shapes. Oral tradition is evolution, not replication. It mutates, it adapts, it survives. But let us return to a smaller scene, one closer to the fire. Imagine a winter night 20,000 years ago, deep in Ice Age Europe. Snow presses against the walls of a cave. Children huddle close to the hearth. An elder lifts his hands, casting long shadows on the stone walls painted with bison and horses. His voice begins slow, steady. He tells of a great hunt, of spirits hidden in the animals, of ancestors watching from the stars. The children lean closer, wide-eyed. Every pause, every gesture is deliberate. He is not merely entertaining them, he is shaping the way they will see the world. In this moment, the elder is both historian and prophet. He ties their survival to obedience, to ritual, to respect for the hunt. The story is not neutral, it commands, and because the command is wrapped in wonder, it will not be forgotten. When those children grow, they will repeat it to their own children, each time adding their own breath, their own rhythm. Through them, the story walks forward in time. And here is the most extraordinary truth. For tens of thousands of years before writing, this was enough. Humanity spread across the earth, built cultures, crossed seas, all carried forward by nothing more than words and memory. But what does this tell us about ourselves? perhaps that we are not creatures of tools first, nor of cities, but of stories. The first great technology was not stone or bronze. It was narrative, a way to bind together the past and the future, to link the living with the dead, to make survival meaningful. And yet, there is danger in such a reliance. For if stories are lost, knowledge collapses. Archaeologists studying oral traditions in North America discovered that when a storyteller died without passing on his repertoire, entire epics vanished forever. Imagine an encyclopedia, erased in a single breath. Imagine history itself dissolving with the last heartbeat of a single person. That was the fragility of the oral age. It is humbling, isn't it, to think that your life could be the only bridge for centuries of memory? That without your voice, the chain might break. What burden must it have been to be that final link? And yet, perhaps that fragility is also what made stories burn so brightly. Knowing they could vanish, people clung to them, nurtured them, repeated them endlessly. It gave them urgency, intimacy, weight. Every retelling was an act of resistance against silence. Today, we write everything. We digitize, we archive, we preserve. But ask yourself, when was the last time you memorized a story so deeply you could repeat it word for word? What stories will you carry if the lights go out? We must not mistake permanence for immortality. Clay tablets shatter. Hard drives fail, but the human voice, fragile as it is, has endured through fire, famine, and ice. Perhaps that is the lesson. What seems weakest can sometimes last the longest. At the end of this second journey, let us pause with a question. If your ancestors carried stories for 1,000 generations without writing, which of their words still live inside you, and how will you keep them alive? What is a story, if not a bridge across time? And yet bridges must rest on pillars. For oral traditions, those pillars were memory techniques woven into culture itself. People did not leave remembering to chance. They designed rituals, rhythms, and communal structures so that forgetting was almost impossible. Without such scaffolding, the chain of memory could never have stretched across thousands of years. Take the Aboriginal songlines of Australia. These are not merely songs, but living maps. Each verse corresponds to a landmark, a waterhole, a bend in the river, a constellation above. To sing the songline is to walk the land in memory. For tens of thousands of years, such songlines guided people across a continent with no written maps, ensuring that even if the land changed with time, its essence remained fixed in melody. Imagine the genius of encoding geography into music. The mind carries what parchment cannot, and the landscape itself becomes a text that can be sung. Similarly, in ancient Polynesia, oral traditions turned the night sky into a library. Navigators trained their entire lives to recall the positions of hundreds of stars, the ways they rose and fell on the horizon, the shifts in wave patterns beneath their boats. But this knowledge was never recited as cold instruction. It was sung in chants, told as stories of ancestors who became stars, transformed into myth so that memory carried both precision and meaning. The ocean was terrifyingly vast, but story gave it order. This intertwining of memory and meaning is the secret of oral endurance. Facts alone slip away, but facts woven into story cling like ivy to stone. When you are told that a certain animal is sacred because it was once an ancestor who sacrificed himself for the tribe, you do not forget. When you are told to avoid a certain plant because it belongs to the spirit of sickness, you remember. Myth is memory wrapped in emotion. Emotion is glue. But this leads us to a question. How much of what survived was fact, and how much was shaped by the need to persuade, to frighten, to awe? If myth is a memory device, then distortion is not a flaw, but a feature. The story is designed less to tell you exactly what happened than to ensure you never forget what matters. We see this clearly in flood myths. across the world in Mesopotamia, India, China, Oceania, and the Americas. Tales of great floods echo through millennia. The details differ. In one story, a god grows angry. In another, a trickster breaks a dam. In yet another, the sea itself rises to punish humanity. The mechanism shifts, but the warning remains. Beware the waters, for they can swallow the world. Oral tradition distilled not the literal event, but the truth of vulnerability. And yet, astonishingly, some oral stories do preserve literal details across impossible spans of time. In Australia, oral traditions tell of coastlines now drowned beneath the sea, stories dating back 7,000 years to the end of the last ice age. Anthropologists once doubted such accuracy was possible, but geological evidence now confirms that those tales describe real events, the slow swallowing of land by rising oceans. Here we glimpse the power of human memory when fused with ritual. Stories can indeed carry fact across millennia, surviving without ink, without stone, without machines. But what of the human voice itself? The medium of transmission was not only memory, but performance. A story spoken flat dies quickly. A story spoken with rhythm, with gesture, with movement, lives longer. This is why so many oral traditions blur the line between story and dance, between history and song. Knowledge was not transmitted in silence. It was embodied. The whole body became an archive. A storyteller swayed, sang, stamped, raised arms like wings. The gestures themselves became part of the memory. To remember was to reenact, and to reenact was to pass on. This embodied knowledge also explains why oral traditions were inseparable from community. A story was rarely told alone. It was told with others present, witnesses to its performance. The community acted as a living archive, correcting mistakes, reinforcing details. If one teller faltered, another corrected. In this way, memory was not stored in individuals, but distributed across groups. Knowledge became communal property, defended against loss by redundancy. One might die, but the story lived on in many. But there is another dimension: secrecy. Not all stories were shared with everyone. Some were sacred, reserved for initiates, for elders, for priests. Access to them was restricted through ritual. Why? Because rarity enhances value and secrecy ensures precision. If a story is known only to a select few, those few guard it with ferocity, rehearsing it endlessly to preserve its purity. Oral cultures understood that scarcity itself was a tool of preservation. The more sacred a tale, the less it was allowed to drift. Still, even sacred stories changed, for change is inevitable. A story retold in a new landscape acquires new colors. A myth that begins in the mountains may, when carried to the sea, transform to speak of waves and storms. The skeleton persists, the flesh adapts, and in this tension between continuity and change lies the resilience of human culture. Consider language itself. Before writing, languages lived and died entirely in speech. Thousands have vanished without trace. Yet in surviving oral traditions, we see hints of words far older than writing. Linguists have traced common roots in Indo-European tongues back perhaps 6,000 years, reconstructing fragments of the speech of people who lived before history. Their words are gone, yet echoes remain in the stories told by their descendants. The tale is a fossil of the tongue, and so, across continents and centuries, oral traditions formed a vast invisible web. Each community held its threads, weaving them night after night. Together, they formed the memory of humanity before archives, before books, before screens. What does this reveal about us? Perhaps that we are not simply tool makers or hunters, but beings who cannot live without story. Our survival was not secured by weapons alone, but by meaning. A spear can kill an animal, but only a story can tell you why it matters, how it should be shared, what dangers it represents, and how your people remain bound together in its shadow. Even now, in the modern world, fragments of this ancient habit remain. A bedtime story, a wedding speech, a chant at a protest, a song sung at a funeral. These are not new inventions. They are echoes of the first storytellers. They remind us that, even surrounded by books and screens, we still lean on the same old technology: the voice, the rhythm, the shared act of telling. But let us not romanticize too much. Oral traditions carried wisdom, yes, but also superstition, oppression, violence. A myth could encode ecological knowledge, but it could also justify conquest. A story could preserve memory, but also enslave minds. Power flowed through stories as surely as it flows through weapons. Whoever controlled the tale controlled the tribe. And this truth, the political power of narrative, has never vanished. It began long before writing, and it remains with us today. So at this point in our journey, the paradox sharpens. Oral traditions were fragile, yet enduring, mutable, yet faithful, liberating, yet controlling. They kept us alive, even as they bound us. They were both gift and chain. And now we pause with a question that will guide us forward. If stories were once our only way of remembering, what does it mean that we now drown in written words, in archives so vast no one can carry them? Have we gained permanence, or have we lost the intimacy that once made memory sacred? If stories were once our libraries, then they were also our courts, our governments, our laws. Before writing, justice itself was carried in memory. There were no tablets etched with commandments, no scrolls of statutes, no legal codes bound in leather. Instead, morality and order lived in stories, tales of heroes and tricksters, ancestors and gods, cautionary figures who embodied the boundaries of right and wrong. The tribe did not say, "Do not steal." Instead, it told of a hunter who hoarded meat and was cursed, or a spirit who punished greed until the thief was driven into exile. In this way, justice became not an abstract decree, but a narrative woven into daily life. This blending of law and story gave morality teeth. To disobey was not simply to break a rule. It was to step into the path of mythic consequences. The supernatural stood ready to enforce memory. If you dishonored your kin, the ancestors might withhold rain. If you spoke lies, the spirits of sickness might creep into your dreams. In a world where stories were law, justice was inseparable from the sacred. Anthropologists studying oral cultures have long noticed this overlap. Among the Yoruba of West Africa, stories of the Orisha, divine beings with human flaws, were recited not only for entertainment, but as lessons in moral conduct. In Native American traditions, trickster figures like coyote or raven were both mischievous and wise, teaching boundaries by breaking them. Even the Norse, before they carved their runes, told sagas of gods whose rivalries explained the rules of honor and vengeance. The stories did more than entertain. They taught what society required in order to endure. But why stories and not commands? Because commands are brittle. They invite resistance. Stories, by contrast, seduce. You do not argue with a tale. You remember it, you repeat it, you allow it to shape you quietly. In the rhythm of oral tradition, law was absorbed through the heart rather than imposed upon the mind. A story is harder to forget than a rule. Yet this power came with danger. For if those who controlled the stories controlled morality, then the memory of a people could be shaped to serve. The few elders who guarded myths might enforce them selectively. Leaders could justify authority by claiming descent from a mythical ancestor, weaving blood and narrative into legitimacy. To obey the chief was not only to obey a man, but to obey the story of the tribe itself. So oral tradition was never innocent. It was a weapon as well as a gift. It bound people together, but it could also bind them into obedience. to ask whether the story was true, missed the point. Its truth was not measured by evidence, but by power. If the story was remembered, it shaped reality. And yet, within this system of living law, stories did not remain static. They shifted with need. When a tribe encountered new challenges, drought, war, famine, the stories bent to absorb them. A new cautionary tale explained why rituals must be observed. A new genealogy justified alliances with strangers. Oral tradition was fluid, and this fluidity made it more resilient than any written code. Where stone law might break, story law could bend. Think of the stories of origin. Nearly every oral culture tells of where its people came from, how the world began, and why they dwell in a particular land. These origin myths were not trivial. They grounded identity. They explained not only the past, but also the future. To lose them was to lose belonging. To remember them was to remain rooted even through migration and displacement. And here we find another paradox. Stories made communities eternal, yet they also reminded each generation of its mortality. The ancestor might live on in myth, but each teller knew that without his voice, the story might vanish. To recite a myth was to confront death, one's own, and the death of memory itself. Each performance was an act of defiance. Though I will die, the story will not. It is no coincidence that so many myths grapple with death and rebirth. The cycle of life, decay, and renewal was mirrored in the cycle of memory. Stories die when unspoken, but they rise again when told. This eternal return of memory gave people hope that nothing was ever truly lost. A hero slain today might return tomorrow in a new story. An ancestor buried might still speak through the lips of his descendants. In this sense, oral tradition was humanity's first philosophy of immortality. But how did these laws of story extend beyond the campfire, across rivers and mountains? Through marriage, through trade, through war. A bride carried her people's myths into a new family. A trader brought songs along with goods. Even conquest spread stories. The victors imposed their myths, but the defeated whispered theirs in secret until, sometimes, the two fused into something new. Over centuries, these exchanges created shared mythologies. The Indo-European peoples, scattered across Eurasia, carried similar sky gods, storm deities, and fire myths because their ancestors once told stories in common. The tales drifted apart but retained their bones, like siblings grown into different forms. The oral web was vast, stretching farther than any empire. And yet, despite this reach, stories remained intensely local. The myth that bound one village might be unknown a few valleys away. This localism gave stories intimacy. They were not universal proclamations, but living bonds of particular people to particular places. A river spirit mattered only if you drank from that river. A mountain god mattered only if you saw that peak each morning. Story was geography, made flesh in words. To outsiders, oral stories often seemed strange, filled with impossible beings and unlikely events. But to those within, every detail was loaded with practical knowledge. A monster in the forest warned of predators. A tale of a jealous spirit warned against selfishness. Oral traditions encoded rules for survival, but they hid those rules in wonder. Wonder ensured that children listened. Fear ensured they obeyed. But let us not forget the beauty. For if fear preserved rules, beauty preserved meaning. The rhythm of a chant, the rise and fall of a mythic song, the laughter at a trickster's mischief. These were pleasures that ensured the story's survival. The more beautiful the tale, the more likely it was to endure. Our ancestors were not merely pragmatic, they were poets, weaving survival into art. And so, for thousands of years, justice, identity, and belonging flowed through the same channel. Story. To live in an oral culture was to live inside a tapestry of tales that explained everything. the stars above, the rivers below, the moral choices of daily life. All were wrapped in narrative. The world was not random, it was storied. And to remember the story was to remember how to live. At this point in our journey, we pause to reflect. We often imagine that civilization began with writing, with records carved into stone. But is it not possible that civilization, the binding together of people into a moral and meaningful order, began instead with stories told in the dark? Perhaps writing did not invent civilization, but merely froze what had long been alive. So let the question linger in the silence. What is more enduring, the word carved into stone, or the story carried from mouth to mouth, from heart to heart, across 1,000 generations? What happens when a story remembers not only gods and spirits, but people? When the deeds of ancestors, hunters, chiefs, and wanderers enter the stream of oral tradition, something new emerges. Proto-history. It is not yet history in the written sense, but it is memory stretched beyond the living into the domain of the dead. It is the attempt to make the past walk again through words. Imagine a gathering around the fire where an elder tells not of spirits in the sky, but of the time when the tribe crossed the mountains, when their forebears fought an enemy, when their people were nearly starved but endured. These are not myths of creation or divine punishment. They are fragments of lived memory, polished by time, coated in metaphor, but rooted in events that truly happened. The stories of ancestors became the first histories, though no one called them so. Archaeologists and historians have long debated where myth ends and history begins. In the oral traditions of the Pacific, genealogies stretch back dozens of generations, each ancestor named in careful sequence. Among Polynesians, these genealogies guided not only memory, but politics. To claim descent from a revered ancestor was to claim authority. Accuracy mattered, but so did prestige. Sometimes lines were extended, ancestors multiplied, gaps filled in. Yet even amid embellishment, kernels of real events persisted. Modern research has shown that such oral genealogies can indeed preserve time frames accurate enough to align with archaeological evidence. In West Africa, the griots, custodians of memory, carried not only epics of gods, but detailed accounts of kings and wars. In their chants, one hears both mythic exaggeration and concrete fact. Dates of reigns, names of rulers, the outcomes of battles. They were not historians as we imagine them, but they were the memory of nations. To forget their words was to lose the identity of a people. And in the Pacific Northwest of North America, tribes preserved stories of earthquakes and tsunamis. For centuries, these were told as tales of a great struggle between spirits or a ravenous sea that devoured the land. To modern ears, they sounded like myth. But geological research later revealed that these tales described a real event, the Cascadia earthquake of the year 1700. The sea had indeed swallowed villages, and the memory survived, disguised as story. Oral tradition was not merely fantasy, it was an archive. But archives in speech are fragile. They bend under the weight of memory. What was once fact becomes metaphor. What was once a name becomes a symbol. In this transformation, truth is not lost, but transfigured. Oral history is like a river. It carries sediment of reality, but it reshapes the banks as it flows. The past becomes both preserved and reimagined. Consider the Trojan War. For centuries it was known only as legend, recited by bards before Homer ever wrote his epic. To many, it was myth, but archaeology uncovered the ruins of Troy, revealing that a warlike city had indeed stood, and that conflict had consumed it around the time the stories placed it. The bard's tale was not literal truth, but neither was it empty fiction. It was memory refracted through poetry, surviving centuries without writing until it was finally pinned to a page. And here lies a profound question. Is history itself anything more than a story that has been written down? If myth and memory carry traces of fact, and writing freezes them into permanence, then the line between myth and history is not as clear as we imagine. Perhaps the difference lies not in truth, but in medium. The ancients themselves seem to recognize this blur. In many oral cultures, the ancestors were not distant figures of the past, but presences still living in story. To recite their names was to call them into the present. The past was not back there. It was alive in the telling. This collapsing of time created a world where history was not separate from myth, but part of the same continuum. And in this continuum, identity was forged. To be a people was to share a story of where you came from and what your ancestors had endured. Without that story, you were unmoored. You were no one. This is why so many tribes guarded their histories fiercely, training chosen members to carry them forward. To forget was to dissolve. But if oral traditions preserved proto-history, how far back could they reach? Could they, as some suggest, preserve memories not just of centuries, but of millennia? The evidence is haunting. Aboriginal stories of drowned coastlines date back 7,000 years. Norse sagas, carried orally before being written, describe volcanic eruptions in Iceland centuries before. Native American stories tell of mammoths and giant beasts long extinct, suggesting echoes from the Ice Age itself. Could it be that the human mind, sharpened by ritual and repetition, can indeed hold memory for thousands of years? If so, then the oral age was not a time of forgetfulness, but of astonishing endurance. We moderns, surrounded by books and servers, often imagine ourselves superior in memory. But perhaps our reliance on writing has weakened our natural capacities. The ancients trained memory like a muscle, making it capable of feats we can scarcely imagine. Still, memory has its price. In an oral culture, forgetting is always a looming threat. A storyteller slain in war, a plague that silences elders, a migration that breaks ritual. These can erase centuries of knowledge in a single moment. Unlike writing, which endures independently, oral memory lives and dies with people. The archive burns with the body, and yet some stories always endure. Why? Because they matter most. The stories tied to survival, to identity, to cosmic meaning, these are the ones carried forward. A tale about a lost hunt may vanish, but the myth that explains the tribe's place in the universe persists. Oral tradition is not a perfect archive. It is a sieve. What falls through is detail. What remains is essence. Perhaps this is why oral proto-histories often blend fact with myth. A war becomes a cosmic struggle. A famine becomes divine punishment. A migration becomes a sacred journey. The literal truth dissolves, but the deeper truth, that the tribe endured, that survival required meaning, survives. Oral history teaches us less about what happened and more about why it mattered. And here, in this paradox, lies the beauty of oral tradition. It does not give us the sterile precision of a written chronicle, but it gives us something more human, memory infused with meaning. For what is history, if not the attempt to give the past purpose? Let us pause, then, and ask, if stories carried history long before writing, how many of our myths are not myths at all, but faintly glowing embers of real events, distorted yet alive? How much of the deep past whispers still in the stories we dismiss as legend? In this thought, one hears the echo of voices older than any page, speaking across the abyss of time. They tell us, we were here, we endured, and we leave our footprints not in stone, but in story. When human beings first looked upward at the night sky, they were gazing into a vast silence. No writing marked the stars, no scientific charts mapped their courses, and yet the sky was never empty. It was filled with stories. Constellations became ancestors, lovers, beasts and spirits. The movements of the heavens were not abstract mechanics, but dramas unfolding above. The stars spoke, and oral traditions translated their speech. For many cultures, the sky was the ultimate canvas of memory. Unlike rivers or forests, which could shift and change, the stars returned faithfully each night. Their patterns endured across generations, serving as anchors for story. To connect a tale to a constellation was to guarantee its permanence. As long as the stars remained, the story lived. In ancient Polynesia, navigators memorized star lines, sequences of rising and setting stars that guided them across thousands of miles of open ocean. These were not written in books. They were sung. The chants were long, rhythmic, repetitive, designed to be carried in memory like a compass of sound. To know the chant was to hold the sea itself in your mind. One wrong verse, one forgotten star, could mean death. Precision was survival, and survival was embedded in story. Among the Greeks, long before astronomy was formalized, constellations carried myths that explained both natural cycles and human virtues. Orion was the hunter, placed among the stars by Zeus. Perseus and Andromeda traced the tale of sacrifice and rescue. To know these stories was to read the heavens like a book, each cluster of stars a page in an endless celestial epic. Oral tradition preserved cosmology before there was science, and in Australia, Aboriginal songlines bound sky and earth together. A constellation above matched a path on the land below. To sing the stars was also to walk the land. Story was not confined to one realm. It stitched together heaven and earth into a seamless web. A child who learned the songline carried not just myth, but a working map of both worlds. What we call mythology, they called knowledge. To us, myths appear fanciful, filled with gods and monsters. To them, myths were encyclopedias. They explained the tides, the seasons, the migration of animals, the taboos of society. Wrapped in metaphor, they contained practical truths. You did not cross a certain river, not only because spirits guarded it, but because crocodiles lurked there. You did not cut down a sacred grove, not only out of reverence, but because it preserved water in drought. To encode wisdom in story was to guarantee its transmission long after the original reason was forgotten. This blending of cosmology and practicality reveals the dual nature of oral tradition. It explained both how the world works and how humans must behave within it. The sky told you not only when to plant or migrate, but also why life had meaning. Without writing, the cosmos itself became a living text, read aloud each night in the language of story. But the stars also introduced a deeper layer, time itself. Oral traditions taught that the heavens were cycles, endlessly repeating. Day followed night, seasons followed one another, constellations returned as they always had. From this repetition came the idea of eternal return, the sense that nothing was ever truly lost. A hero slain might rise again when his star reappeared. A god cast down might return with the next season. The story never ended, for the sky itself guaranteed its continuation. And yet this vision of endless cycles was both comforting and confining. Comforting because it suggested immortality. Confining because it bound humans to a cosmic rhythm from which they could not escape. In oral cosmologies, freedom was not the goal. Harmony was. To live rightly was to walk in step with the stars, to follow the song lines, to repeat the rituals. Memory was cosmic, and the cosmos was memory. But what happens when the stars change? When a comet streaks across the sky, or an eclipse plunges the day into darkness, or a star vanishes forever? In those moments, oral traditions adapted. A new story was born to explain the rupture. A god had grown angry, a hero had fallen, a prophecy had arrived. The sky was a stage, and unexpected events were not random but messages. The universe itself was speaking, and the people replied by weaving new words into their tapestry. This interplay between observation and story reveals something profound. Oral tradition was humanity's first science. It was not science as we define it, with equations and proofs. It was science clothed in metaphor. People observed, they tested, they remembered. They encoded patterns into narratives so that they could be recalled and shared. In this sense, every myth is both poetry and data. It tells of gods, but beneath the gods lies careful attention to the world. Take, for instance, flood myths again. They are not merely spiritual warnings, but memories of rising seas at the end of the Ice Age. Or the myths of fiery mountains, often dismissed as fantasy, which correspond to real volcanic eruptions witnessed by ancestors. Oral cosmology was a way of preserving anomalies, recording them not in stone, but in collective memory. And yet, myths did more than explain the world. They explained us. Who are we? Why are we here? What happens when we die? Oral traditions grappled with these questions long before philosophy was formalized. The answers varied. We were clay shaped by gods, sparks fallen from the stars, descendants of animals, children of trees. But all answers carried the same impulse, to give human life a place within the cosmic story. Without writing, that place could only be remembered in words carried from one generation to the next. What is striking is how many of these stories endured even into the age of writing. The myths of creation, of cycles, of heroes, of floods. They did not vanish with the invention of script. They were written down, but they were not born on the page. They were echoes of voices far older, shaped by tongues long silent. Homer did not invent the Iliad. He froze what had been sung for centuries. The Rig Veda of India was recited long before it was written. The Norse sagas were chanted before they were carved in runes. Writing did not create the stories. It merely captured them. And perhaps something was lost in that capture. Oral stories were alive, shifting with each telling, responsive to the needs of the moment. A bard could emphasize courage in one age, endurance in another. A flood myth could teach obedience during drought, resilience during war. Once written, the story became fixed. It gained permanence, but it lost flexibility. The living became artifact. The voice became ink. So what should we value more, permanence or life? Is it better that a story survives unchanged, or that it breathes and adapts, even if it risks distortion? Oral tradition chose life. Writing chose permanence. Both are legacies of humanity, but they carry different visions of time. At this point in our journey, we stand before the stars as our ancestors once did. Imagine the fire dying low, the heavens ablaze, the elder's voice rising into the night. Around you, children listen with wide eyes. Behind you, generations of the dead lean closer. Ahead of you, unborn descendants wait to hear the same words. In that moment, you are part of a chain that stretches across 1,000 generations. The story is not yours alone. It belongs to time. And here, as we pause, one question lingers. When we look at the stars today and see only spheres of gas, what stories have we lost? And in losing them, have we also lost a way of belonging to the universe itself? If a story lives only in words, it risks vanishing. But if a story is enacted, danced, sung, performed, it becomes harder to forget. This is why ritual was inseparable from oral tradition. Ceremony ensured memory. It bound knowledge not only to the tongue, but to the body, the senses, the rhythms of collective life. Without writing, performance was permanence. Imagine a midsummer gathering on the plains 15,000 years ago. Hundreds of people have come together from scattered bands. A fire burns at the center of the camp. Drums begin to beat. The storyteller does not merely speak. He moves, he chants, he calls out, and others answer. The community claps, stomps, sings in unison. In that moment, the story is no longer an individual act. It is a collective rehearsal of memory. The body remembers what the mind alone might forget. Anthropologists describe this as embodied knowledge. In many cultures, stories were inseparable from rituals that marked birth, initiation, marriage, and death. Each milestone in life was accompanied by a performance that embedded narrative into the participant's very identity. A child did not simply hear the story of the tribe's origin. They enacted it in dance, painting their body with symbols, singing the ancestral song. By the time they were grown, the story was not just something they knew. It was something they had lived. Consider the Dogon people of Mali. Their elaborate ceremonies encode astronomical knowledge, myths of creation, and social rules. The rituals last days, involving masks, dances, and chants. For the Dogon, the story is not abstract. It is walked, breathed, inhabited. This pattern repeats across cultures. Story survives not because it is told once, but because it is woven into the rhythms of communal life. And ritual was not only memory, it was power. To perform a story was to bring it into being. In oral traditions, myth was not a past event, but an eternal drama reenacted. When the community performed the tale of creation, the world was renewed. When they sang of the harvest, the crops were blessed. In this sense, oral tradition blurred the line between narrative and reality. To tell the story was to participate in the cosmos itself. This may seem strange to modern ears, but even today, fragments survive. A wedding ceremony retells the story of union. A national anthem retells the story of identity. A funeral reenacts the story of passage into another world. We still live in rituals, though we forget that they are stories in motion. Yet in the oral age, ritual had another crucial function. It was a filter against distortion. Stories told casually might shift too quickly, but rituals bound them in form. The chant had to follow the rhythm. The dance had to follow the pattern. The mask had to resemble the ancestor. By repeating the same gestures year after year, community ensured continuity. Ritual froze story and performance, just as writing would later freeze it on the page. Still, no ritual was entirely rigid. Within its repetition lay room for variation, subtle shifts that allowed the story to adapt. A new mask added, a verse altered, a gesture emphasized. These changes kept the story relevant without breaking its core. In this way, ritual balanced permanence with life, anchoring tradition while allowing it to breathe. But ritual was also exclusionary. Not everyone could perform every story. Some tales were sacred, restricted to initiates or elders. To learn them required passage through ordeals, symbolic deaths and rebirths. Memory was not given freely. It was earned. This secrecy gave stories weight. Knowledge that cost something to receive was valued, guarded, rehearsed with greater care. In this way, oral traditions developed, hierarchies of memory, dividing the sacred from the ordinary. And this exclusivity served another purpose: protection. In times of war or conquest, when outsiders threatened to erase a people's voice, secret rituals ensured that core stories survived underground. History offers countless examples of colonized or oppressed communities preserving their traditions in hidden ceremonies, whispered songs, coded performances. Oral tradition was resilient because it could hide in plain sight, disguised as dance or song, even when forbidden. But what did rituals mean to those who performed them? They were not merely obligations. They were ecstasies, moments of transcendence. The drumbeat, the chant, the dance carried people out of themselves, binding them into one body. In those moments, the community experienced what scholars call collective effervescence. a shared state of awe that reinforced bonds and renewed memory. Story was not simply heard, it was felt with the pulse of the heart and the rhythm of the feet. Consider again the ancient campfire. A story told there is fragile, dependent on ears that may or may not recall. But a story enacted in a ceremony with dozens or hundreds of participants is harder to lose. Each remembers a fragment. Together, they hold the whole. Oral tradition survived not only because of individual memory, but because ritual distributed memory across the many. This distribution also extended across time. Children participated from an early age, watching, imitating, absorbing. By the time they were old enough to take the lead, the ritual was etched into their bones. Memory was not transferred once, like a book handed from one to another. It was layered, rehearsed, absorbed gradually over years until it became indistinguishable from identity itself. And yet, for all its power, ritual was not unchanging. History shows us that ceremonies evolve. What began as a sacred story might become a seasonal festival, then a public spectacle, then a faint echo of its origin. Oral traditions were always in flux, bending to the needs of the present while carrying the shadows of the past. This mutability ensured survival. A story that could not adapt would die. A ritual that lost relevance would fade. But if it could shift while maintaining its symbolic heart, it would endure across centuries. Here we glimpse the genius of oral tradition. It was not brittle, but supple. Its flexibility made it stronger than stone. A monument can crumble, a ritual can be reborn. Yet there is a haunting side. Rituals could also entrench power. Those who controlled ceremonies controlled memory itself. To forbid someone from the ritual was to deny them history, to make them an outsider. Oral tradition was not always inclusive. It was often a gatekeeper. This truth should not be forgotten. But despite these tensions, ritual gave humanity something profound: continuity. To stand in the same circle, sing the same song, tell the same story as one's ancestors was to feel time collapse. The living and the dead joined in a single performance. The story was not just about the past, it was the past alive again. What does this mean for us now? We live in a world saturated with text, yet ritual still shapes us. From graduations to funerals, from chants in stadiums to ceremonies of state, we continue to embody stories without realizing it. Perhaps we are not so far from our ancestors after all. And so we arrive at another question, pressing and timeless. If rituals once carried our most important stories, what rituals do we now practice that will endure? Which of our ceremonies will be remembered centuries from now when the words we write have turned to dust? Stories are not rooted. They move. They travel with feet, with sails, with exile, with trade. Unlike stones or monuments, they are light enough to cross oceans, yet heavy enough to bind whole peoples. If we imagine the oral world as a vast landscape, then the pathways of trade and migration were its rivers, carrying stories from one shore to another. Picture an ancient caravan trudging across the desert, camels laden with salt, ivory, or obsidian. At night, when the goods are set aside and the fire burns low, the traders share tales. One recounts a story of a god who cursed a river. Another sings of a mountain spirit from far away. Around the fire, the stories mingle, absorbed by listeners who will carry them on to distant lands. By the time the caravan reaches its destination, the tale is no longer the same. It has been reshaped, retold, reimagined, but its bones endure. In this way, myths spread like seeds, scattered by the winds of human movement. We see the traces everywhere. The flood myths of Mesopotamia echo in the stories of India, China, and Oceania. Trickster figures appear in Africa, in the Americas, in Polynesia. Sometimes a fox, sometimes a coyote, sometimes a raven, but always a mischief maker who bends rules and exposes human folly. Why such similarities? Because human experience, carried across continents, planted similar seeds in different soils. Oral traditions did not stay still. They traveled with us, evolving like languages, adapting like living organisms. Consider the Polynesians again, whose voyaging canoes stitched the Pacific together long before writing reached those islands. Each canoe carried more than people and food. It carried chants, genealogies, and cosmologies. When settlers arrived on a new island, they retold the old myths in the new landscape. A mountain might become the body of an ancestor, a reef the bones of a god. Over time, the story changed shape, but the core remained. And when these islanders voyaged again, they carried their hybrid stories onward, weaving the Pacific with threads of narrative. Or consider the Indo-European migrations, which spread not only languages, but mythic motifs from India to Ireland. Sky gods, stormbringers, dragon-slaying heroes, these figures appear across continents because they traveled orally with migrating peoples. Each culture reshaped them, yet one can trace the lineage, as if following the genetic code of memory. Stories were not static. They were migratory beings, adapting to new homes like seeds finding fresh soil. But not all story movement was voluntary. Some traveled through conquest and exile. When one people overran another, their myths clashed. Sometimes the victor imposed their gods, erasing the old. Sometimes, however, the two fused, producing new hybrids. The Greek pantheon absorbed local deities as it spread. The Roman Empire carried its myths across Europe, reshaping them as it encountered Celtic, Germanic, and Egyptian traditions. Oral memory was never a pure stream. It was a confluence, a mingling of waters. This mingling produced both continuity and conflict. A people could claim superiority by asserting that their gods had defeated the gods of others, or they could form alliances by merging stories, creating kinship where blood had not yet bound them. Oral tradition was not just cultural inheritance. It was diplomacy, politics, and power. And yet, even amid conquest, the oppressed carried their stories in secret. When empires rose, local myths hid in lullabies, in riddles, in whispered songs. These hidden oral traditions could outlast the empire itself, waiting in the shadows until they could be spoken aloud again. Story is resilient. It finds cracks in power through which to survive. But how did people ensure that traveling stories were remembered? The answer lies again in performance. A tale carried into a foreign land was not repeated mechanically. It was dramatized, sung, made relevant to the new audience. A god of one mountain became a god of another. A flood once tied to one river was now linked to a new sea. Oral tradition does not cling to the literal. It clings to the meaningful, and meaning can adapt without breaking. This adaptability explains why similar myths appear in cultures that never met. Human beings across the world faced floods, storms, hunger, betrayal, love, death. The stories they carried across distances resonated because the experiences were shared. A listener in a new land did not hear a foreign tale. He heard his own life reflected in a new form. That recognition allowed the story to take root. But we must also imagine the fragility of this process. Stories were vulnerable in transit. A war could silence a generation of tellers. A migration could scatter people before the tale was passed on. Whole libraries of memory have been lost this way, erased without a trace. The silence of history is filled with the absence of those stories. What we know today is only a fraction of what was once spoken. Still, enough survived to reveal the patterns. Consider the similarities between the myths of the Maya and those of Mesopotamia. Both describe cosmic trees connecting heaven and earth. Or the echoes between the Norse Yggdrasil and the Ardzi shamanic world trees of Siberia. These are not coincidences. They are testimonies to the deep structures of human imagination carried across landscapes. Oral tradition was humanity's first global network, invisible yet expansive, binding people across vast distances with shared metaphors. And this network was not merely cultural, it was practical. Traders carried news of distant lands, dangers, and opportunities. Oral traditions passed warnings of deserts, directions to water, knowledge of winds and currents. Memory moved along the same routes as goods. A story about a dangerous pass was as valuable as the obsidian carried on a mule's back. Information was survival, and oral tradition was the carrier of that information. So we begin to see, oral tradition was never local in the way we often imagine. It was already global, long before writing. Words leapt across continents in the mouths of wanderers, merchants, refugees, and warriors. Humanity's web of memory existed in sound long before it existed in text. But this raises a haunting question. In this constant movement, how much was preserved and how much was lost? How many of the world's earliest stories vanished when no one chose to carry them onward? And what does it mean that our species remembers selectively? That we keep some stories and let others die? The paradox sharpens again. Oral tradition is fragile, dependent on the breath of tellers, yet it is also immortal, capable of crossing deserts, seas, and centuries. It is a system that forgets constantly, yet ensures that the most vital meanings endure. Think of your own life. How many stories have you carried from your family, your culture, your childhood? How many have you forgotten? Which did you pass on, and which will die with you? In that choice lies the same ancient process, repeated across generations. You, too, are part of the migration of memory. And so we pause at the threshold of understanding. Stories move not only across places, but across time, binding the living to the dead, the near to the distant, the present to the unborn. To carry a story is to carry the echo of countless others who have spoken it before. At this point in our journey, the question grows more insistent. If humanity once carried its memory and voices across deserts and oceans, what stories will we choose to carry forward in an age when so much can be written, recorded, and preserved? Will we still remember how to let a tale travel freely, reshaping itself, living in the breath of wanderers? Or will permanence make us forget the power of the journey itself? Stories do more than explain the world or guide survival. They also decide who we are. Long before borders, flags, or written constitutions, identity was carried in stories. To belong to a people was to know their tales, to repeat their ancestors' names, to share their myths of origin. If you could not tell the story, you were not part of the tribe. Memory was citizenship. Narrative was nationhood. Consider the genealogies recited in Polynesia, in Africa, in the Middle East. To know your lineage was not simply to know your family, it was to anchor yourself in the cosmic order. Genealogies stretched back into myth, linking human beings to gods, to stars, to the earth itself. In this way, identity was not only personal, but cosmic. You were not just a child of your parents, but a descendant of heroes, a vessel of divine ancestry. The story made you larger than your life. But identity is never neutral. Stories do not simply include, they exclude. They draw boundaries between us and them. To know the story was to be inside. To lack it was to be outside. Oral traditions, therefore, were both glue and wall, binding a community together while marking others apart. This is why so many myths emphasize chosen peoples, divine favor, ancestral destiny. They gave cohesion within, but also justification against without. Among the Norse, sagas recounted the deeds of ancestors who founded clans, setting them apart from rivals. Among Native American nations, stories of origin tied each tribe to its own sacred landscape, differentiating them from neighbors. Among the Hebrews, Oral tradition told of a covenant with God, binding their people to a destiny unique among nations. These were not trivial tales. They were identity itself, carried across generations through recitation, and identity, once shaped, became resilient. Conquerors might burn villages, scatter populations, enslave survivors. But if the story survived, so too did the people. Oral tradition could outlast conquest. A people without land could still live in their story, carrying it into exile. History offers many such examples. Jewish memory preserved in exile, African traditions carried through slavery, indigenous myths whispered under colonial rule. To silence the voice was harder than to seize the land. Yet the power of story to unify also carried danger. Leaders understood that controlling stories meant controlling identity. By claiming descent from gods, rulers established legitimacy. By monopolizing sacred myths, priesthoods secured power. Oral tradition became a tool of hierarchy as well as community. To question the story was to question the entire structure of belonging. In this way, stories both liberated and constrained. But what is striking is that oral identity was always collective. In our modern world, identity is often framed as personal, a matter of self-definition. In the oral world, identity was communal. You were not defined by your private story, but by the shared story of your people. To lose that story was to become nobody, to fall into silence. This raises a profound question. How did oral traditions balance the need for continuity with the inevitability of change? For identity must adapt, or it becomes brittle. The answer lies in the way stories absorbed new experiences without abandoning their core. A tribe forced to migrate reinterpreted its myths to explain the new land. A people conquered reshaped their story into one of suffering and endurance. A community that adopted outsiders rewove their genealogies to include them. Oral tradition was flexible, and that flexibility allowed identities to survive upheaval. Consider the African diaspora. Enslaved peoples, torn from their homelands, carried fragments of stories across the Atlantic. In the Americas, these fragments fused with new landscapes, new struggles, new hopes. Trickster tales, ancestor songs, cosmologies of rhythm and spirit endured in altered forms, shaping new identities in exile. Oral tradition became resilience, a way to survive dislocation by carrying identity in the heart. Or think of the Celts, whose oral traditions endured long after Rome attempted to erase them. Their bards, forbidden to write, continued to sing genealogies and epics that preserved cultural memory in secret. Centuries later, fragments of those songs still echo in mythic cycles of Ireland and Wales. A people nearly erased by empire endured because their stories refused silence. But identity in oral tradition was not only about survival, it was also about transcendence. By linking people to gods, stars, and the dead, stories offered more than belonging. They offered immortality. A person might die, but if their name was recited in the genealogy, if their deeds were sung in a saga, they lived on. Memory was resurrection. In this way, oral traditions turned mortality into continuity. The dead remained present as long as their stories were told. This intimacy between memory and immortality explains why ancestors loomed so large in oral cultures. To honor them was to keep them alive. To forget them was to kill them a second time. Oral identity was therefore a sacred duty. You carried not only your life, but the voices of the dead within you. And so, identity was layered, personal, communal, cosmic. Each person was a link in a chain, responsible for carrying forward not only the practical knowledge of survival, but also the meaning of existence itself. This weight could be heavy, but it also gave life depth. To be human was to be storied. But we must pause and ask, what happens when stories conflict? when one group's identity collides with another's. Oral traditions did not prevent war, they often fueled it. Myths of chosen peoples, divine favor, or ancestral rites became reasons for conquest. Stories could sanctify violence as easily as they sanctified survival. Even today, echoes of this persist as communities invoke ancient narratives to justify conflict. The power of oral identity is double-edged. It preserves and divides, unites and excludes. And yet, even amid conflict, stories could also build bridges. Trade, intermarriage, and alliance often produced shared myths, hybrid identities. Two peoples might fuse their ancestors into a common genealogy, blending their destinies. Oral tradition could divide, but it could also reconcile, weaving new fabrics of belonging. Here lies the paradox once again. Stories are both walls and bridges, both weapons and shelters. They carry the deepest wounds of humanity, and they also carry its most enduring hopes. If we step back, we see that oral tradition did not simply tell people who they were. It created the very possibility of we. Without shared stories, there is no community. Without community, there is no survival. The tribe was not bound by blood alone, but by narrative. And that bond proved as strong as any fortress, as enduring as any empire. At this point in our journey, as we near the end of the long road of the oral age, we must ask ourselves, what stories today define who we are? Which tales bind us into communities, nations, faiths? And which stories do we choose to silence, forgetting that in their loss lies the loss of identity itself? The silence of forgotten stories is not empty. It is full of absences. Identities erased, peoples dissolved. But the persistence of stories is equally powerful. It tells us that as long as someone remembers, identity endures. So we arrive at another haunting question. If a story can outlast exile, conquest, and even the death of language itself, what will outlast us? Which of our identities are fragile and which will be remembered across 1,000 generations? At last, we arrive at the threshold where the spoken world meets the written one. For tens of thousands of years, human memory traveled only by voice, by song, by ritual. But then, slowly, in scattered places, symbols appeared. Marks on clay, lines on bone, carvings in stone. At first they were not words, merely counts, tallies, signs. Yet once the idea took root, that memory could be stored outside the body. Everything changed. The invention of writing was not a sudden miracle. It was a gradual unfolding. Farmers marked the number of sheep. Merchants recorded their debts. Priests inscribed offerings. These early notations were pragmatic, not poetic. But they carried a hidden revolution. They severed memory from the fragile thread of breath. No longer did a story need to live only in a voice. It could be fixed, external, enduring. The story no longer died with the storyteller. And yet, as writing grew, something was lost. Oral tradition had been alive, adaptable, shaped to each moment and each audience. Writing froze the story. It preserved details, but it silenced improvisation. A tale once responsive to community became a fixed text. The living turned into artifact. Consider the epics. The Iliad and the Odyssey were sung for centuries before they were written. In their oral form, they shifted constantly, each bard emphasizing what mattered most to his listeners. When they were finally written down, they gained permanence but lost fluidity. A single version survived, while countless variations vanished. Writing preserved, but it also pruned. What had been a forest of voices became a single tree. We must ask, is permanence always better than life? Oral tradition accepted distortion, embraced variation, allowed change. Writing resists change, insisting on fidelity. Yet fidelity can be brittle. A written text can be destroyed in fire. An oral story, even if altered, can endure as long as someone remembers. Which is truly stronger, the fragile page or the fragile voice? This tension remains unresolved. Writing allowed civilizations to grow vast, laws to become complex, histories to be archived. But oral traditions preserved something writing could not: intimacy. To sit before a storyteller is to feel the weight of memory as presence, not artifact. The breath, the gesture, the rhythm, these cannot be inscribed. Writing preserves content, but not experience. Oral tradition gave us both. And perhaps that is why, even after writing, oral traditions never vanished. They persisted alongside text, carrying songs, folk tales, and wisdom through the centuries. In many places, they remain stronger than writing still. A grandmother's story, a song sung at a funeral, a whispered prayer, these survive because they are embodied. They remind us that human memory is not only about record, but about relation. Yet the transition to writing did alter humanity profoundly. With writing came distance. Stories could outlive the teller, travel to strangers, reach those who never saw the storyteller's face. This distance allowed universality, but it weakened communal intimacy. Oral tradition bound people into tribes. Writing allowed the invention of nations, empires, religions that spanned continents. Stories grew larger, but perhaps less personal. Still, the oral age left its mark. Even in our texts, we hear the echoes of performance, rhythm, repetition, formula. The Bible was recited long before it was written. The Vedas were sung for centuries before they were inked. The Norse sagas carried the cadences of bards. Writing captured what was already ancient. Beneath the text, the voice still lingers. So what can we learn from the long era before writing? Perhaps that humanity does not live by bread alone, nor by tools or weapons, but by stories. For 100,000 years, people survived by carrying meaning in memory, binding their lives to one another through shared narrative. Without writing, they built civilizations of the mind. Without writing, they endured ice ages, migrations, wars. Without writing, they gave us the myths that still shape us. And perhaps we should ask ourselves, what do we lose when we no longer rely on memory? In our age, everything is recorded. Every word can be archived, every image preserved. Yet how much of it do we truly remember? Has the abundance of writing made us forget the art of carrying stories within? Our ancestors trained memory like a muscle. They sang, they chanted, they rehearsed until their minds became libraries. Today, with libraries outside us, perhaps our inner libraries have grown weak. But there is hope in remembering this history. For even now, we are still oral beings. We crave stories told aloud. We gather in theaters, in churches, in living rooms to hear voices speak meaning into the air. We listen to songs, to poems, to bedtime tales. We still trust the voice, even when surrounded by screens of text. Perhaps this is proof that the oral age has never truly ended. And if we look deeper, we see that oral tradition was not only about survival, it was about beauty. The rhythm of chants, the laughter of tricksters, the awe of creation myths. These were not strictly necessary for hunting or farming. They were art. They revealed that humanity is not only pragmatic but poetic, not only logical but imaginative. Before writing, beauty itself was carried in memory, kept alive because it mattered. At the end of this long journey, let us stand once more at the fire with our ancestors. The stars blaze overhead. The storyteller clears her throat. Around her, children lean close, elders nod, shadows dance on stone walls. The words begin, rising and falling, carrying the weight of generations. In her voice live 1,000 generations before her and 1,000 yet to come. In that moment, we understand. Story is not only how humans remember, It is how humans are. So we ask the final question, the one that lingers like embers in the dark. What is the true archive of humanity? Is it the clay tablet, the scroll, the hard drive? Or is it the fragile, enduring voice that carries memory across 1,000 generations? Perhaps the answer is both. Writing gives us permanence, but story gives us life. Together, they make us whole. And if you listen closely tonight, in the quiet between your own thoughts, you may hear the echo of voices older than any text, whispering across the millennia. They say, remember us, carry us, become us.